Laura Bennett had $37, a broken-down Ford, and a secret that could destroy everything she'd built in the past 5 years. Steam poured from under the hood as her car wheezed to a stop beside the wooden sign that read Carter Ranch. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, and tried to calm her racing heart. This had to work. It just had to. "Mama, is the car broken again?" 5-year-old Sophie looked up from her coloring book in the back seat, her dark eyes wide with concern. She had been so good during their long drive from Phoenix, never complaining about the broken air conditioning or the strange noises coming from the engine. "It's okay, sweetheart," Laura said, forcing a smile into her voice. "We're here now." She turned around to look at her daughter's beautiful face, the face that had gotten them into this mess in the first place. Sophie's resemblance to her late sister was so strong it sometimes took Laura's breath away. But lately, she'd been noticing something else in Sophie's features, something that made her heart skip with both hope and terror. Laura stepped out of the car and surveyed the ranch spread before them. Rolling green pastures stretched toward distant mountains, and a large red barn sat next to a modest but well-maintained farmhouse. Horses grazed peacefully in a nearby field, and she could hear cattle lowing somewhere in the distance. It looked like something from a postcard, the kind of place where people built real lives instead of running from their past. That's when she saw him. Ethan Carter stood near the corral, working with a beautiful black horse that danced nervously at the end of a rope. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and strong shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. When he looked up at the sound of her car, door closing, Laura felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear for the first time in years. Ethan walked toward them with an easy stride, pulling off his work gloves. "You must be Laura Bennett," he said, extending his hand. His voice was deep and warm, with just a hint of a Texas drawl. "I'm Ethan Carter. Got your email about the ranch hand position." Laura shook his hand, noting the calluses and the gentle strength in his grip. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Mr. Carter. I know my background is a little unusual." Ethan's smile was genuine as he glanced toward the car, where Sophie was still coloring. "Not unusual at all. Plenty of folks need a fresh start. That's what ranch life is good for." He studied Laura's face with kind blue eyes. "You mentioned you have experience with horses and cattle management." Laura felt heat rise in her cheeks. Her experience came entirely from library books and YouTube videos. But desperation made people creative with the truth. "I've studied ranch operations extensively, and I'm a very fast learner. I also have a business degree, so I could help with the bookkeeping side of things too." "That's mighty helpful," Ethan said, sounding impressed. "Been trying to keep the books myself, but I'm better with horses than spreadsheets." He gestured toward the house. "Why don't we go inside and talk details? Your little girl is welcome to come too." Laura's heart lifted. Most potential employers ran the other way when they learned about Sophie. "Sophie, honey, come meet Mr. Carter." Sophie climbed out of the car, clutching her coloring book and a worn stuffed rabbit. She was small for her age, with silky black hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and the most expressive dark eyes Laura had ever seen. She wore a simple yellow dress that Laura had bought at a thrift store, and her little white sneakers were scuffed from their travels. "Hello," Sophie said shyly, tucking herself against Laura's leg. "Well, hello there, Miss Sophie," Ethan said, crouching down to her level. "That's a beautiful picture you're coloring. Is that a horse?" Sophie nodded solemnly and held up her coloring book to show a purple horse with pink wings. "It's a flying horse. Mama says maybe I can see real horses here." "I guarantee it," Ethan said with a chuckle. "We got plenty of horses, and some of them are almost as pretty as your flying one." Laura watched the interaction with growing hope. Sophie rarely warmed up to strangers, but there was something gentle about Ethan Carter that put even her nervous daughter at ease. Maybe this place really could be their sanctuary. "Well, let's head inside and talk business," Ethan said, standing up. "I've got fresh coffee on, and I think there might be some cookies in the kitchen." Sophie's eyes lit up at the mention of cookies. It had been 2 days since they'd had anything better than gas station snacks. Laura followed Ethan toward the house, Sophie's small hand tucked securely in hers. The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with wide windows that let in plenty of natural light. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the home, with a large wooden table and the lingering scent of coffee and something that smelled like homemade bread. Ethan poured coffee for Laura and found a glass of milk and a plate of chocolate chip cookies for Sophie, who sat quietly at the table working on her coloring. "So tell me about yourself," Ethan said, settling into the chair across from Laura. "What brings you to Colorado?" Laura had rehearsed this story 100 times, but sitting across from Ethan's honest face made the lies feel heavier than usual. "I'm recently divorced," she said, which was technically true if you counted a legal name change and fake death certificates as divorce. "Sophie's father isn't in the picture, so it's just the two of us. I wanted to find someplace quiet and safe to raise her, away from the city." Ethan nodded understandingly. Ranch life can be good for kids. Teaches responsibility and gives them room to grow. He glanced at Sophie, who was now feeding tiny pieces of cookie to her stuffed rabbit. "She seems like a sweet little thing. She's the best part of my life," Laura said, and that was completely true. Everything she had done, every lie she had told, every mile they had run, it was all for Sophie. They talked for another 20 minutes about the job requirements, salary, and living arrangements. The small guest house behind the main building needed some work, but it would be perfect for Laura and Sophie. The job itself would involve helping with the horses, maintaining fences, and assisting with the cattle during roundup season. The pay wasn't much, but it came with room and board and the kind of anonymity Laura desperately needed. "I think this could work out real well," Ethan said finally. "When can you start?" Laura felt tears prick her eyes. After months of rejection and disappointment, someone was finally giving them a chance. "Tomorrow, if that works for you. We don't have anywhere else to be." "Perfect." Ethan stood and extended his hand again. "Welcome to Carter Ranch, Laura Bennett." As they prepared to leave, Sophie ran over to Ethan and tugged on his shirt. When he bent down, she stood on her tiptoes and planted a sweet kiss on his cheek, the way she always did when saying goodbye to people she liked. "Thank you for the cookies," she said solemnly, "and for letting us stay." "You're very welcome, little lady," Ethan replied, but something strange had come over his face. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced by something Laura couldn't identify. Shock, maybe, or recognition. Sophie skipped back to Laura and raised her arms to be picked up. "I love it here, Mama," she whispered as Laura lifted her. "Can we really stay?" "Yes, sweetheart," Laura said, kissing the top of Sophie's head. "We can really stay." But when she looked back at Ethan, he was staring at Sophie with an expression that made Laura's blood run cold. His face had gone completely pale, and his hands were trembling slightly. Whatever he was seeing when he looked at her daughter, it wasn't good. "Is everything all right, Mr. Carter?" Laura asked carefully. Ethan seemed to shake himself back to the present. "Fine," he said curtly, but his voice had lost all its previous warmth. "Just fine. You can move into the guest house tonight if you want. Start work at dawn." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the corral, leaving Laura standing there with Sophie in her arms and a terrible certainty that their peaceful new life had just gotten very complicated. As she buckled Sophie into the car, Laura caught Ethan staring at them through the kitchen window. His lips moved silently, and though she couldn't hear the words, she could read his lips clearly enough. "Maria," he whispered, and Laura's heart nearly stopped beating. Who was Maria, and why did seeing Sophie make Ethan Carter look like he'd seen a ghost? Laura barely slept that night in the small guest house. Every creak of the old wooden floors made her jump, and she found herself checking and rechecking the locks on the doors. Sophie had fallen asleep quickly in her new bedroom, exhausted from the long day and clutching her stuffed rabbit tight. But Laura lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment when Ethan's face had changed. The way he'd whispered Maria haunted her thoughts. When dawn broke over the mountains, Laura was already dressed and ready for work. She'd chosen her most practical clothes: jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt she'd bought at a secondhand store in Phoenix. Her long black hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she'd applied just enough makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. Sophie was still sleeping when Laura kissed her goodbye and headed to the main house. She'd left a note telling Sophie to stay inside and play quietly until she got back for lunch. The 5-year-old was used to entertaining herself, a skill she'd learned during their many moves over the past few years. Ethan was already in the barn when Laura arrived, feeding the horses with mechanical efficiency. He barely looked up when she entered, his friendly demeanor from yesterday completely gone. "You're late," he said coldly, though Laura's watch showed it was exactly 6 o'clock. "I'm sorry," Laura said, even though she wasn't late at all. "What would you like me to start with?" "Mucking stalls," Ethan replied without looking at her. "Shovels over there. Wheelbarrows by the door. I'm sure someone with your extensive book learning can figure it out." The sarcasm in his voice stung, but Laura bit her tongue. She needed this job too desperately to let pride get in the way. She grabbed the shovel and got to work, trying to remember everything she'd read about proper stable maintenance. The work was harder than the books had made it seem, and within an hour her back was aching and her hands were blistered despite her gloves. Ethan watched her struggle without offering any help or guidance. When she accidentally knocked over the wheelbarrow, spilling dirty straw across the barn floor, he just shook his head and walked away. Laura fought back tears of frustration as she cleaned up the mess, wondering what she'd done to deserve such treatment. Meanwhile, Sophie had woken up in the little guest house and was exploring her new surroundings. The house was small but cozy, with a tiny kitchen and living room that opened onto a screened porch overlooking the pastures. Sophie pressed her nose against the screen, watching the horses graze in the morning sun. She'd never been this close to real horses before, and they were even more beautiful than in her coloring books. As she wandered through the house, Sophie discovered a bookshelf in the living room filled with old magazines and novels. Most of them were too grown up for her, but tucked between two dusty paperbacks was a photo album. Sophie pulled it out carefully and settled on the couch to look through it. The album was filled with pictures of the ranch from years past. There were photos of cattle roundups, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. But it was the picture on the last page that made Sophie gasp. Staring back at her was a little girl who looked exactly like her own reflection. The same dark hair, the same big brown eyes, even the same dimple in her left cheek. Sophie stared at the photo in fascination. The little girl was standing next to a young man who looked like Mr. Carter, but his face was happier and his eyes weren't sad like they were now. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in careful handwriting, "Maria, age 5, first day at Carter Ranch." Back in the barn, Laura was struggling with her second wheelbarrow load when she heard Ethan curse under his breath. She looked up to see him standing frozen in the doorway, staring at something behind her. Laura turned around and saw Sophie walking toward them, the photo album clutched in her small hands. "Mama," Sophie called out, her voice excited. "Look what I found. There's a little girl in this book who looks just like me." Laura's heart stopped as Sophie held up the open album, displaying the photo of young Maria. She glanced at Ethan and saw all the color drain from his face. His hands were shaking, and he looked like he might collapse. "Sophie, honey," Laura said carefully, setting down her shovel. "You shouldn't have gone through Mr. Carter's things without asking." But Sophie was too excited to listen. She skipped over to Ethan and held the photo up for him to see. "Look, Mr. Ethan, isn't she pretty? She looks just like me, doesn't she?" Ethan stared down at the photo, then at Sophie's eager face. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Laura could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sound of cattle in the fields. Finally, Ethan reached out with trembling fingers and took the album from Sophie's hands. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "In the little house," Sophie said. "On the bookshelf. I'm sorry if I wasn't supposed to look. I just like pictures." Ethan knelt down, so he was at Sophie's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. He studied every detail of her face as if he was memorizing it. "What did you say your name was, sweetheart?" "Sophie Bennett," she replied. "But sometimes Mama calls me Soph or Sophie B." "Sophie," Ethan repeated softly. He looked up at Laura with confusion and something that might have been pain. "How old is she?" "5," Laura answered, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. Ethan closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "Maria would have been 32 this year," he said to no one in particular. "She died 3 years ago in a car accident on her way home from Denver." Laura felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. "Mr. Carter, I don't understand." "Neither do I," Ethan interrupted, standing up abruptly. He looked down at Sophie again, and his expression was a mixture of wonder and anguish. "But this little girl looks exactly like my wife did when she was 5 years old. Exactly like her." Sophie looked back and forth between the two adults, sensing the tension but not understanding it. "Was Maria your little girl too?" she asked innocently. Ethan's face crumpled. "No, sweetheart. Maria was my wife. We lived here together until she went to heaven." "Oh," Sophie said solemnly. "That must make you very sad. When my first mama went to heaven, it made me sad too." Laura's heart clenched. Sophie rarely talked about her birth mother, Laura's sister who had died when Sophie was just 2 years old. But the innocence of the comment seemed to break something open in Ethan. He reached out hesitantly and touched Sophie's cheek. "You said your first mama," he said gently. "What happened to her?" Sophie looked up at Laura for permission. Laura nodded, knowing there was no point in hiding this part of their story. "She got sick and went to heaven," Sophie explained. "But then Mama Laura became my mama, and she takes very good care of me." Ethan's eyes snapped to Laura's face. "Laura isn't your birth mother?" "She's my sister's daughter," Laura said quietly. "I've been raising her since she was 2. Ethan stared at them both for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he handed the photo album back to Sophie and stood up. "I need some air," he said, and walked out of the barn without another word. Laura watched him go, her mind racing. The resemblance between Sophie and young Maria was impossible to ignore, but what did it mean? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something more? Sophie tugged on Laura's shirt. "Mama, did I make Mr. Ethan sad?" Laura knelt down and pulled Sophie into a hug. "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups get sad when they remember people they miss." "Maybe we should make him cookies," Sophie suggested. "Cookies always make me feel better when I'm sad." Laura smiled despite her worry. "That's a very kind idea, sophomore. But right now, I think Mr. Ethan needs some time alone." As they walked back toward the guest house, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival at Carter Ranch was not the coincidence she'd thought it was. The resemblance between Sophie and Ethan's late wife was too strong to be random. But if there was a connection, what was it? And more importantly, would it help them or destroy the new life they were trying to build? Behind them, Ethan stood in the pasture watching them go. In his hand, he clutched a small photo he'd pulled from the album. A picture of Maria as a child, smiling at the camera with the same dimpled grin that Sophie had flashed him just moments before. "What are you trying to tell me, Maria?" he whispered to the wind. "What am I supposed to do with this?" 2 days passed with Ethan avoiding Laura and Sophie completely. He would disappear before dawn and not return until after dark, leaving Laura to figure out the ranch work on her own. She was getting better at it, but the silence was driving her crazy. Every time she caught a glimpse of him watching them from a distance, he would turn and walk away. On the third evening, Laura had finally had enough. After putting Sophie to bed, she marched over to the main house and knocked on Ethan's door. When he opened it, she could smell whiskey on his breath and see the pain in his red-rimmed eyes. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Ethan started to close the door, but Laura put her hand against it. "Please. Sophie keeps asking why you won't talk to her anymore. She thinks she did something wrong." Something in Ethan's face softened at the mention of Sophie. He stepped aside and let Laura into the living room. The space was masculine but comfortable, with leather furniture and family photos on the mantel. Laura noticed that all the pictures of Maria had been turned face down. "I've been married once before," Ethan said without preamble, settling heavily into his armchair. "Maria Santos. We met when she was 18 and I was 25. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, full of life and laughter. We had 10 good years together before the accident." Laura sat on the edge of the couch, watching his face carefully. "What happened?" She was driving back from Denver after visiting her sister. It was raining, and she hit a patch of ice on a mountain road. Ethan's voice was flat, emotionless. "They said she died instantly. That was supposed to make me feel better, I guess." "I'm sorry," Laura said softly. "That must have been devastating." Ethan looked up at her with haunted eyes. "Do you know what it's like to lose the only person who ever really mattered to you? To wake up every morning and remember all over again that she's gone." Laura's throat tightened. She thought about her sister, about the night she'd gotten the call that changed everything. "Yes," she whispered. "I do." Something passed between them in that moment, a shared understanding of grief that words couldn't capture. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "When I saw Sophie with that photo," he said, "it was like seeing Maria as a child. Not just similar, identical. Same eyes, same smile, same little dimple. It's impossible, but there it is." "Maybe it's not as impossible as you think," Laura said carefully. "Sophie's mother, my sister, she was adopted. We never knew anything about her birth family." Ethan's head snapped up. "Adopted?" Laura nodded. "From Colorado, actually. She was born in Denver and placed for adoption when she was just a few days old. The records were sealed, but maybe—" She trailed off, seeing the hope and fear warring in Ethan's expression. "Maybe Maria had family she never knew about," Ethan finished. "Maybe Sophie is her niece or cousin." Before Laura could respond, her cell phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet room like a knife. Laura glanced at the caller ID and felt her blood turn to ice. The number was blocked, but she knew who it was. She'd been dreading this call for weeks. "I have to take this," she said, her voice shaking. "Laura Bennett." The voice on the other end was smooth and dangerous. Or should I say, Laura Martinez? "It's been a long time." Laura closed her eyes, her worst nightmare coming true. "David." Ethan watched her face go pale and immediately stood up, sensing danger. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" David continued. "You are my daughter?" "She's not your daughter," Laura said through gritted teeth. "You know that. The courts will see it differently. I have custody papers, Laura, legal guardianship. You kidnapped Sophie, and now it's time to bring her home. Over my dead body." David's laugh was cold. "That can be arranged. You have 48 hours to decide. Come back to Phoenix willingly, or I'll come get both of you. And you know I always keep my promises." The line went dead. Laura stared at the phone, her hands trembling. "Who was that?" Ethan asked, moving closer. Laura looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "My ex-husband. He found us. I thought you said you were divorced." "It's complicated," Laura said, standing up on shaky legs. "We have to leave. Tonight. I won't put you or this place in danger." Ethan caught her arm as she headed for the door. "Wait, what kind of danger?" Laura turned back to him, and Ethan saw real terror in her eyes. The kind that gets people killed. David isn't just abusive. He's connected to some very dangerous people. Sophie is the only leverage they have over me, and they'll do anything to get her back. "Why? What did you do?" "I testified against them in court. I helped put half of David's organization in prison, and now they want revenge." Laura pulled free from his grip. "I have to pack. We'll be gone within the hour." But as she reached for the door handle, Ethan's voice stopped her cold. "What if you didn't have to run anymore?" Laura turned around slowly. "What do you mean?" Ethan's jaw was set with determination. "What if you had someone willing to fight for you?" Laura's hands trembled as she pulled Sophie close. "I need to tell you both everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the ranch. Ethan moved closer, his protective instincts on high alert. "Laura, whatever it is, I'm not Sophie's mother," she interrupted, the words tumbling out like a dam breaking. "I'm her aunt. My sister Lisa was Sophie's real mom." Tears streamed down her face. "Lisa died in a car accident 5 years ago, but it wasn't an accident. My ex-husband David had her killed because she was going to testify against him." Sophie gasped, burying her face in Laura's shoulder. Ethan's jaw clenched. "I was a prosecutor in Chicago," Laura continued. "David ran money laundering operations for the mob. I thought I was marrying a businessman, but when I discovered the truth and tried to leave, he threatened everyone I loved. Lisa was trying to help me gather evidence when—" Her voice broke. Ethan knelt beside them. "The night Sophie's mother died, David's men ran her car off the road. Made it look like an accident. I grabbed Sophie and ran. We've been hiding ever since. Why didn't you go to the authorities?" Ethan asked gently. Laura laughed bitterly. "David has connections everywhere. Cops, judges, officials. I tried once in Denver. Within hours, we were running again." She looked at Sophie. "I legally adopted her using falsified documents. Everything we've built, our entire life, is based on lies." Sophie pulled back, her young face determined. "You saved me. You're my mom in every way that matters." Ethan stood, scanning the horizon where the black SUV had been. "My army unit specialized in protection details. This ranch has natural defensive advantages." He was already thinking tactically. Ridgelines provide cover, single access road, good sight lines. The rumble of engines interrupted him. 3 black SUVs rolled up the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust. Laura's face went white. "Take Sophie to the back bedroom," Ethan ordered, grabbing his rifle from the gun cabinet. "There's a hidden safe room behind the bookshelf." "Ethan, no." Laura grabbed his arm. "David isn't just some criminal. He's smart, connected, and completely ruthless. You don't understand what you're up against." "Then help me understand," he said firmly. "But I'm not letting either of you face this alone." The vehicle stopped 50 yards from the house. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out of the lead SUV, flanked by 2 large men in suits. Even from a distance, Laura could see David's cold smile. "Laura," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Bring Sophie out. We need to talk." Ethan stepped onto the porch, rifle visible but not raised. "This is private property. You're trespassing." David's laugh was sharp and mirthless. "Mr. Carter, isn't it? I'm David Bennett, Sophie's legal guardian. I have court documents giving me custody." He held up official-looking papers. "My niece has been kidnapped for 5 years. I'm here to take her home." "Those papers are fake," Laura called from the doorway. Sophie pressed behind her. "Are they?" David's smile widened. "I have a judge in Chicago who might disagree. You see, Laura, when you disappeared with Sophie, you became a kidnapper. I've been the grieving uncle searching for his dead sister's child." Ethan's finger moved to his rifle's safety. "Get off my land. Or what? You'll shoot a concerned relative trying to save a child from her kidnapper?" David gestured to his men. "I brought help in case Laura became unstable." Laura's legal mind raced. David was right. He'd constructed a perfect legal trap. On paper, he looked like the victim. "I'll give you until sunrise to decide." "Laura," David called out, getting back into his SUV. "Come willingly with Sophie, and I might let your boyfriend live. Refuse, and I'll use those marshal's warrants. I have to take her by force." As the vehicles drove away, Sophie emerged from behind Laura. "I won't go," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I'd rather die than go with him." Ethan pulled them both close. "That's not happening. David Bennett just made a big mistake." "What's that?" Laura asked. Ethan's smile was cold and dangerous. "He threatened my family." Dawn broke over Carter Ranch with an ominous red sky. Ethan had spent the night preparing, his military training taking over. He'd contacted Sheriff Martinez and 3 neighboring ranchers. men who'd served alongside him in Afghanistan. By sunrise, they had defensive positions established along the ridge overlooking the ranch house. Laura sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked, bringing her coffee. "What I should have done years ago," Laura replied grimly. "Fighting back with what I know best, the law." The rumble of engines announced David's return. This time, he brought 6 vehicles and twice as many men. They spread out in a semicircle, blocking all escape routes. Laura's stomach churned as she recognized the tactical formation. David stepped out, immaculate in his $1,000 suit despite the rural setting. Behind him walked a woman in plain clothes and 2 marshals. Laura's blood ran cold. He made good on his threat about official involvement. "Laura Bennett," the woman called through a megaphone. "Deputy Harris, U.S. Marshals Service. I have a warrant for your arrest on kidnapping charges. Send the child out and surrender yourself peacefully." Ethan appeared on the porch, hands empty but stance ready. "Let me see that warrant." Deputy Harris approached cautiously, document in hand. Ethan studied it carefully, his legal knowledge from dealing with military contracts serving him well. The warrant looked authentic, complete with seals and signatures. "This says Laura kidnapped Sophie Bennett from her legal guardian 5 years ago," Ethan said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's right," David called out smoothly. "My sister Lisa died in a tragic accident." Laura, overwhelmed by grief and mental instability, took Sophie and disappeared. "I've been searching for my niece ever since." Sophie burst through the front door despite Laura's attempts to hold her back. "He's lying," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "He killed my real mom. Laura saved me." "Sweetheart," David's voice dripped false sympathy. "You were just a child. Trauma can distort memories. I'm here to take you home, back to Chicago where you belong, back to your real family. This is my real family." Sophie's voice cracked with emotion. "Laura is my mom. Ethan is my dad now. And this ranch is my home. I won't leave." Deputy Harris looked uncomfortable. Something about the situation wasn't sitting right with her. "Mr. Bennett, the child seems genuinely distressed about returning with you." "Of course she is," David replied smoothly. 5 years of brainwashing by an unstable woman who's filled her head with fantasies about me being some kind of criminal. Laura appeared in the doorway, her laptop in her hands. "Deputy Harris, before you execute that warrant, you might want to see this." She held up the screen, showing financial records, photographs, and recorded conversations. 5 years of evidence documenting David Bennett's money laundering operation, his connections to organized crime, and the murder of my sister Lisa. David's composure cracked slightly. More desperate lies from a woman facing charges. "Then explain this," Laura said, clicking to a recorded phone conversation. David's voice filled the air. "Lisa became a problem. Problems get solved permanently. Make it look like an accident." Deputy Harris's hand moved to her weapon. "Where did you get this recording?" "Lisa was wearing a wire the night she died," Laura explained. "She'd been gathering evidence for months. The recording was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server I set up. I've been afraid to use it because I didn't know who David had compromised in law enforcement." "That recording is fabricated," David snarled, his mask of civility finally dropping. "This woman is a criminal. Then you won't mind if we verify its authenticity," Deputy Harris said coldly. She spoke in her radio. "Command, I need a full background check on David Bennett, Chicago. Cross-reference with organized crime databases." The response crackled back immediately. "Harris, David Bennett is wanted for questioning in connection with multiple investigations. Proceed with extreme caution." David's men shifted nervously. They'd signed up to intimidate a woman and child, not face marshals and armed ranchers. "You stupid bitch," David hissed at Laura, his hand moving inside his jacket. Ethan's rifle was up and aimed before David's gun cleared leather. "Don't even think about it." Sheriff Martinez's voice boomed from the ridge. "David Bennett, you're surrounded. Drop your weapon and surrender." But David was beyond reason now. Years of careful planning unraveling in minutes. "If I can't have Sophie, nobody can." He raised his pistol toward the girl. Sophie stood frozen, but Laura dove in front of her just as the shot rang out. The bullet meant for Sophie struck Laura in the shoulder, spinning her around. Ethan's rifle barked once. David crumpled to the ground, his weapon flying from his grasp. Chaos erupted as David's men scattered, some surrendering immediately, others trying to flee only to be stopped by the ranchers positioned around the property. Deputy Harris was already calling for medical assistance while securing David's weapon. Laura sat propped against the porch railing, Sophie clutching her uninjured arm. "It's over, baby," she whispered, watching as paramedics worked on David. "We're finally safe." Ethan knelt beside them, his hands gentle despite the violence he'd just committed. "Paramedics are coming for you too. That shoulder needs attention." "I'm fine," Laura insisted, then looked at Deputy Harris. "What happens now?" The deputy smiled for the first time that morning. "Now, all charges against you are dropped. David Bennett will be facing charges for murder, money laundering, and about a dozen other felonies. You and Sophie are free to live your lives." As David was loaded into an ambulance under armed guard, he managed one last threat. "This isn't over." But Laura, holding Sophie in Ethan's hands despite her wounded shoulder, smiled peacefully. "Yes, David, it finally is." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the red dawn and promising a bright new day for the family that had found each other against all odds. 6 months later, the autumn sun cast golden light across Carter Ranch as Laura stood in the newly expanded vegetable garden, her shoulder fully healed and stronger than ever. The scar was barely visible now, just a thin line that served as a reminder of how far they'd all come. She smiled watching Sophie and Ethan working together to repair a section of fence, their easy banter carrying on the crisp October air. "Mom, Ethan says I can learn to drive the tractor next week," Sophie called out, her face glowing with excitement. At 15, she'd grown 3 inches and gained the confidence that came from finally being safe. Her grades at the local high school were exceptional, and she'd been elected class president, a far cry from the terrified girl who'd arrived just months ago. "We'll see about that." Laura laughed, but her tone was warm. The transformation in all their lives still amazed her sometimes. The ranch was thriving beyond their wildest dreams. Laura's legal expertise had proven invaluable in expanding their operations, negotiating contracts with organic food distributors across 3 states. What started as a desperate need for work had blossomed into a true partnership. Ethan had officially made her co-owner of the ranch, and together they'd built something beautiful. The sound of an approaching truck broke her reverie. Sheriff Martinez climbed out, his face serious but not alarmed, a look Laura had learned to interpret correctly over the past months. "How's our favorite family doing?" he asked, tipping his hat to Laura. "Couldn't be better, Tom. Coffee. Always." He followed her to the porch where they'd shared so many conversations since that terrifying dawn. "Got some news about David Bennett." Laura's stomach tightened reflexively, but the fear that used to consume her was manageable now. "Good news or bad news? Depends on your perspective. He was sentenced today, life without parole. The prosecutor said your evidence was the key to convicting 3 other members of his organization too." Relief flooded through Laura. "So it's really over." "It's really over," Martinez confirmed. "You did good, Laura. You and Sophie can sleep easy knowing he'll never hurt anyone again." Ethan approached, having heard the tail end of the conversation. His arms slipped around Laura's waist, a gesture so natural now that neither of them thought about it. "Everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," Laura said, meaning it completely. That evening, as Sophie worked on homework at the kitchen table and Laura prepared dinner, Ethan disappeared outside with unusual secretiveness. When he returned an hour later, His hands were dirty, and he wore the satisfied expression of a man who'd accomplished something important. "What have you been up to?" Laura asked suspiciously. "You'll see." His eyes twinkled with mischief. "Sophie, finish that algebra. We're going for a walk in 20 minutes. "But it's getting dark," Sophie protested. "Trust me, kiddo. This is important." As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ethan led them to the hill where Laura had first seen him working with the horses. The spot where she'd felt that initial spark of attraction that had grown into something so much deeper. "This is where I first saw you," he said softly, taking Laura's hands in his. "You were desperate, running from a nightmare, and I was too broken to see the miracle standing right in front of me." Laura's breath caught as Ethan dropped to one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me once that real love isn't about finding the perfect person. It's about finding someone whose imperfections fit perfectly with yours." He opened the box to reveal a beautiful vintage diamond ring. "Laura Bennett, you and Sophie gave me back my life. You turned this ranch from a place I was hiding into a home worth fighting for. Will you marry me?" Through her tears, Laura could barely speak. "Ethan, yes. Of course, yes." Sophie squealed with delight, throwing her arms around both of them. "Does this mean Ethan will officially be my dad?" Ethan wiped away his own tears as he slipped the ring onto Laura's finger. "Sophie, I've been your dad in my heart since the day you called this place home. If you're okay with it, I'd like to make it legal too." "I want that more than anything," Sophie whispered. 3 months later, the wedding. Snow dusted the ranch on the February morning Laura became Laura Carter. The ceremony was held in the barn, decorated with white lights and winter flowers by the entire community who'd rallied around them. Sophie walked Laura down the aisle, radiant in her maid of honor dress, beaming with pride as she placed Laura's hand in Ethan's. "Take care of my mom," she whispered to Ethan, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Always," he promised solemnly. Sheriff Martinez officiated, his usually gruff voice gentle as he spoke about families that choose each other, love that conquers fear, and communities that stand together against darkness. When Ethan kissed his bride, the barn erupted in cheers that could be heard across the valley. The reception lasted until midnight, with dancing, laughter, and toasts that brought tears to every eye. Sophie's speech about found families and second chances left no dry eyes in the house. "When I was little and scared," she said, "Mom used to tell me that family isn't just blood, it's who shows up for you when everything falls apart." Ethan showed up for us when we needed him most. Today, we're not just getting married, we're becoming the family we were always meant to be. 1 year later, Laura stood in the nursery Ethan had built in what was once his office, rocking their 3-month-old son, Michael James Carter. Through the window, she could see Sophie teaching Ethan Jr., as she'd nicknamed her baby brother, the fine art of riding his rocking horse. "Gentle like this," Sophie was saying, guiding the baby's hands. "When you're bigger, Ethan will teach you to ride the real horses. But for now, this is perfect practice." Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face soft with contentment as he watched his daughter with his son. The easy way Sophie had embraced her role as big sister still amazed him daily. "How are my 3 favorite people doing?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Laura. "Perfect," Laura murmured, studying her husband's face. The lines of grief and loneliness that had marked him when they first met were completely gone, replaced by laugh lines and the peaceful expression of a man who'd found his purpose. Sophie bounded through the doorway, covered in hay from the morning chores. "Mom," little Michael smiled at me. A real smile, not just gas. "He knows his big sister." Ethan laughed, pulling Sophie onto his lap despite her protest that she was too old for such things. As Laura looked around the nursery, at the mobile Ethan had carved by hand, the quilt Sophie had helped her make, the family photos covering every surface, she marveled at how a desperate flight from danger had led to this perfect moment. Michael gurgled contentedly in her arms. Sophie and Ethan debating whether the baby was more likely to become a rancher or a lawyer. And outside the window, the land they'd all learned to love stretched endlessly under the Montana sky. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, noticing her contemplative mood. Laura smiled, remembering Sophie's words from their wedding day. "I'm thinking that family really isn't just blood, it's who shows up for you. And I'm thinking we're the richest family in the world." Ethan kissed her forehead as Sophie snuggled closer and baby Michael drifted off to sleep in Laura's arms. Outside, the ranch that had become their sanctuary hummed with the quiet contentment of a family finally, completely, home. The story that began with $37, a broken-down Ford, and a desperate woman running from her past had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of love, courage, and the families we choose for ourselves.